Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Lately, it seems not a week goes by when there aren't at least one or two heartbreaking, frequently first-hand news stories written by a family member or a friend or a medical professional who has watched a loved one or a client or a patient suffering from progressive severe mental illness cycle in and out of the mental health or legal system, wind up on the streets, suffering, vulnerable, delusional, victims or perpetrators of crimes they sometimes aren't even aware that they're part of, who may be provided respite care or hospitalization when they are in most distress, but who are, even with the dedication and selfless efforts of their families or doctors, unable to access or find consistent long-term care to keep them safe and pharmaceutically monitored, to help them commit to their own recovery and even return to their communities and families. And more often than not, these stories do not have a happy or at least hopeful ending. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk about California's new pilot program of legally monitored treatment for people with serious mental illness. It's called the Community Assistance Recovery and Empowerment Court, or CARE Court. Introduced in last year's legislative session as SB 1338 and signed into law by Governor Newsom. The program will connect people in crisis with a court-ordered treatment plan for up to 2 years while diverting them from possible incarceration or homelessness or restrictive court-order conservatorship. CARE Court in California is being called a potential game changer that aims to treat people who have cycled into and out of jail and hospitals and who are at greatest risk of death or serious harm due to their conditions. We are proud to have joining us the two principal Senate co-authors of SB 1338 last year, whose respective legal, medical, and mental health portfolios and collective human compassion make them the ideal legislative ambassadors for this new paradigm shift in mental health treatment for California. Dr. Susan Talamantes Eggman represents California's 5th Senate District, which covers the northern part of California's Central Valley, including her home city of Stockton and Stanislaus County and some of San Joaquin County. She is a former Assembly member. Here in the Senate, she is the newly appointed chair of the Senate Health Committee, the new chair of the Legislative LGBTQ Caucus, the mother of a teenager, and a baker starting during the pandemic. Her delicious honey in the rye bread is a popular thing in the Senate.
I completely concur.
So, Senator Eggman, it's good to have you here. Welcome back.
Nice to be here.
And Senator Umberg, Tom Umberg, represents the 34th Senate District in Orange County in Southern California, including his home of Garden Grove. Senator Umberg is also a former Assembly member. He is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a trustee for the Judicial Council of California, and he and his wife, Robin, are the grandparents to 4 grandkids?
Soon 7.
7. Wow.
6 right now, soon 7.
I need to update my records. Senator Umberg was one of the first legislators I worked with when I started as a staffer in the Assembly in 1991, and neither of us has changed a bit, as you could tell. And we last spoke to Senator Umberg on this podcast back in 2019 in pre-pandemic times as the 2020 census was ramping up in his capacity as chair of the Senate Select Committee on the census. So it's been a while, and we're glad to have him back with us. Senator Umberg, good to see you again, sir.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry you mentioned 1991, but you should include the fact that we were both in high school at the time.
Yes.
Right.
No,
Okay.
I mean,
All
really,
right.
the aging
Right.
process has skipped us both. So,
Absolutely.
No, it's good to have you both, and it's kind of a podcast coup to get two busy senators in the same room at the same time on one issue. So welcome and Happy New Year. And, you know, Senator Eggman, I know life is with a teenager is probably a unique experience for you now. Are you doing okay?
That's a word.
Okay. But you are still baking bread. And in fact, when I was on Chambers yesterday, I saw members carrying this familiar-looking little bags of bread, and I thought, oh, Senator Eggman is
I brought eight loaves in yesterday. I baked, and I was up this morning at 5, baked 3 more.
That's great.
I'm going to get the freshmen first.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay. I was feeling slighted. My self-esteem was impacted.
Don't worry, you're not a freshman. You're not a brand new senator.
She's building bridges with bread, and
Okay,
she'll get to the rest of us.
I feel better. All right.
And congrats on your 7 grandkids. And
Soon to be 7.
Soon to be
6
7.
right now. Next couple months, number 7.
And I hope you have shared with Senator Eggman that grandparenting is reward for parenting.
Yeah, I've met Senator Eggman's daughter, though. She does not seem like the typical teenage daughter. She seems quite mature, quite focused. So you're very fortunate, Senator Eggman.
She's been raised by somebody in elected office, so she knows how to smile
All right,
and shake hands very well.
All right.
Well, I'm glad to have you both here. What I know is already winding up to be a busy 2023 legislative year. I referenced in the opening what seems now to be frequent stories being written about people's loved ones who are suffering from mental illness on the streets, in and out of care facilities. It's heartbreaking, and the sad and devastating conclusions of these stories seem to outpace the hopeful, stable conclusions. Loved ones who disappear off the family radar, and sometimes in worst-case scenarios, they are found dead somewhere. Share your reflections on these firsthand tragedies that we are hearing about in the news more and more, and what it means to the status of mental health treatment here in California circa 2023.
I'll jump in just because it's fresh on my mind right now. I attended the memorial service for Mark Rippey, who was in the press a lot with his struggle, with his family struggle. He was by all reports, a lovely boy, young man, and he was in a devastating motorcycle wreck and was blind. He had a head trauma and then developed a significant mental health issue. He was severely mentally ill. His family did everything they could to help him, and he, at first he was manageable, but as he continued to live without the proper care, he became more and more dangerous for his family and ended up assaulting his mom and lighting a few fires, one in the house, and then they were like, oh, we put him somewhere else in the property in the trailer, and he ended up burning that too. So the family tried everything they could. He had two older twin sisters and a mom and another sister. And they cared for him basically on the streets for 16 years, taking him food, finding him different places, and again, calling repeatedly, only to be told that nobody could help him. So I was asked to attend his service this last week, and we pointed to bills like Care Court and other bills I think that we still need to pass. We often talk about people as the problem, and people are not the problem. Our laws have become the problem. They've become obstacles to people getting the help they desperately deserve and need. And I think it's incumbent upon us to pass things like Care Court, and more this year. But Care Court is certainly, and just as I sit and reflect on being a mental health professional, when I'm teaching at my time as an academic, we often talk about you can't just keep pulling people out of the river who are drowning, right? Especially right now, we have this image of these rivers of water just rolling. And if we just keep pulling people out of the river, we're all going to become exhausted. That we need to figure out upstream why people are falling in the river. And that's the laws that we have created that push people into the river only for us to try to save them on the downstream after they've gone through the rapids, them and their families. We can and we should, and Care Court hopefully will be one more step in doing better.
Senator Umberg, comments on that?
Well, first, I'm honored to be able to jointly author the Care Court initiative with Senator Eggman. She's really been the thought leader in the legislature on mental illness and so many other health issues, but in particular on mental illness and this issue that has become even more prominent, or at least more visible in California. The issue of those who are homeless that have schizophrenia or schizophrenia-like conditions, those that are very, very challenging to reach. And we've tried a number of different approaches, and we've not been successful. We've not been successful in reaching this very challenging population. And so when I first became acquainted with the concept, the governor's initiative, this is the governor's initiative that we were fortunate to be able to shepherd through the legislature, I was very, very interested because I think this is, and this governor describes as a paradigm shift. I think it is a paradigm shift. And one of the things that was interesting and attracted me and I thought unique was accountability and responsibility. While we've devoted significant resources to the issue of mental illness, significant resources to the issue of homelessness, what has, in my view, has been lacking is accountability and authority to basically create a structure for folks to become productive, for folks to be able to receive the treatment that they need, for folks to be able to stabilize in housing, that kind of thing. In my own world, we have a family member, sadly had a family member who would have been aided by Care Court. So I have a great deal of empathy for the families that are suffering because of a family member who is schizophrenic, because of a family member who they don't know where that person is. Families that get up in the middle of the night and start looking for their loved one without really knowing where they should look, just because they can't sleep and know of nothing else to do. Family members that when they get a phone call at 4 a.m, they're actually relieved that it's a phone call from the police, that their family member's in jail as opposed to someplace else. So I'm excited about this, but there's a lot of work to be done. I think the governor's office, Senator Eggman, and I created a structure. It is still a work in progress. It's not going to be implemented until October this year in 7, soon to be 8 counties, and then the rest of California following on the year after. But I am not under any illusion that somehow this is a panacea.
I know it is a pilot project, you said, for this handful of counties. It sounds like, from what I've read just the last few days, that Los Angeles County, assuming the Board of Supervisors fully signs on to this, they're ready to jump ahead and implement before deadlines. So that's promising, right? Or does it just speak to the desperation of what's going on?
I think it speaks to the acute need, number one. Number two is that it's going to require us to up our game. Los Angeles County was going to be in the second cohort because of its size and the complexity in LA County. I suppose I'm enthused that they should think that this is a structure that will be helpful, but it means that we're going to have to, again, find additional resources and really, I mean, it sounds like between now and October is a long period of time, but it's like tomorrow in our world.
One of the criticisms or positives of the Care Court is that it really holds local municipalities, counties, mental health departments accountable for that provision of services. And if they are unable to provide the provision of services that they jointly come up with and that is mandated then by the court, they can be held accountable and fined up to $1,000 a day, which of course is not the goal. But the goal is just to make sure folks get cared for, and it's actually holding systems accountable. So I think it's even more encouraging for those counties, especially Los Angeles County being so large, one of my home counties, Stanislaus, in saying we are ready to do this. We needed a new tool, and we're ready to implement. Some of the people were saying, without a lot more money, you're going to displace people who are already in the mental health system. And our response to that is always, these people are supposed to be in the mental health system. There's not new people entering. These are folks who are the most visible, who we see the most frequently, but are already in these counties who should be getting cared. This just adds a way for the counties to actually be able to provide that care, hopefully in a very meaningful way for the whole system.
Mm-hmm. Let's step back a little bit to the history of mental health treatment here in California and your perspectives on this really complicated history of incarcerating mentally ill persons over the generations, often against their will, the promise and protections that the Lanterman-Petra Short Act, LPS Act, offered, originally intended to provide mentally ill folks here in California, the support, protecting them from forced hospitalization, which was a big deal. But how has it ultimately constrained and impeded efforts to legislate on behalf of and provide treatment for these individuals?
Yeah, I mean, the history was like a lot of things, right? We realized we weren't doing things right. People were being held against their will. They were being institutionalized for long periods of time, and not in a rehabilitation manner, but just more in a warehousing kind of way. So rightly so, we changed the laws to provide mental health care in the communities. Unfortunately, we never followed through on that promise to actually provide a lot of mental health. I mean, we need to be realistic with ourselves. There are always going to be those amongst us who are not going to be able to live independently. I mean, just the nature of human beings. And so to assume that everybody can, I think, was a mistake. And then also not to have those step down, the supportive housing, the kind of wraparound services we now know are so valuable, never existed. And so you ended up people falling through the cracks. And at the same time, you have to think about that was at a time when a lot of families stayed in one place longer. Housing was more affordable. Women weren't working equally with men out in the workplace. So the family members who traditionally may have been able to provide for a family member, that whole structure has changed since we initially passed those laws. Society has changed since we passed those laws. And so to think that somehow the community is just going to provide without the resources to follow it, I think was foolhardy. And now we've recognized it, and now I think we are making up for that. Again, in a compassionate way, to be able to provide care for people.
Historically, we have, I suppose, at best, a blemished record, at worst, a horrific record from 80, 90 years ago, where those with mental illness were incarcerated without any treatment, an abusive situation. Then we went to sort of warehousing folks. What happened, though, is that issue wasn't visible. And after we transitioned from hospitalization, institutionalization modality to community-based treatment, under-resourced, as Senator Eggman points out, this issue's become much more visible in my district. I think in every district, folks are seeing homeless people in their neighborhoods. They're seeing homeless people who are mentally ill, standing in the middle of the street, doing things that folks would describe as crazy, but they're just simply having a psychotic episode. They're acting out based on whatever their reality is at the time. And so one of the upshots is that initiatives like Care Court now have tremendous popular support, whether it's because of people who have personal experience with mental illness in their family, or it's because people are seeing homeless folks in their neighborhood. Whatever the reason, it's now become an issue that's reached the highest level of public consciousness, which is good. It's good for us to be able to, with that public support, try innovative things that we hope are going to make a big difference.
Putting on my academic hat again for a minute, the perfect time for change is during the time of a crisis, right? Crisis theory would tell us things can stay in equilibrium until a crisis occurs, at which point we can change things to create yet a new way of being, which I think Care Court does. Mm-hmm. And you talked about, we used to incarcerate people. Well, we still do. Our prison systems, our jail systems are where our mentally ill are now housed, most unfortunately, who commit crimes most of the time without even realizing they have committed a crime. Mark Rippey was arrested multiple times, right? And not for really breaking the law, but not through any acknowledgement of his own. Some of my colleagues, I just read a report about people with mental health diagnoses being transferred from prison to prison to prison and thinking, we should do something about this. We should have an audit. I'm like, no, it's because we don't help people on the front end. And so they end up in a very expensive prison system that isn't designed to care for them. And then they rotate around. So I think the Care Court and other works like that will work to use this crisis to actually help people, keep them out of prisons and off the streets and in the care that they deserve.
Much better to engage in preventative care than trying to address the issue once someone is homeless or incarcerated.
Indeed.
But one of the things that we're trying to do with Care Court is to both change the modalities, but also change the bureaucracy. I'm just going to give you an example. So the largest mental health facility in my county, Orange County, is the jail. 1/3 of those who are in jail should have some sort of mental health treatment. And we've got money. We've got what was called the millionaire's tax. This created a fairly large pot of money, which can't be used in the jail. So what we do is we have folks who are incarcerated, need mental health treatment. They don't get treatment. They get released. There's no what we'd call a warm handoff to some other entity to provide some sort of treatment. And guess what? They end up back on the street. And guess what? They engage in criminal activity again. And so one of the things that we want to do in this whole concept of Care Court is break that down so that we offer comprehensive care we've got a lot of different well-meaning institutions who are focused on the mentally ill, but create a unified way of addressing those who are most seriously mentally ill.
Absolutely. Well, I think the history on this is important, the perspective. So between Lanterman Petra's Short and CARE Act, we had also Laura's Law in the early 2000s to supposedly supplement the shortcomings of LPS. But some say the law didn't really change any of the criteria, gave local governments only the option to opt in rather than actually required to participate in terms of commitment to folks with mental illness that could be a threat to themselves or others. Give us some perspective on how Laura's Law affected where we are now.
Yes, I think Laura's Law an incredibly important tool, and some would suggest that the Care Court is fashioned somewhat around that, but with all levels of government participating. And I think that is the change, that it is not just a judge, but that our county behavioral health systems are full partners, our judicial system are full partners, as is the legislature, and then a support for that person and family as well. So you have all people coming together to be able to provide that care. So it is Laura's Law fully funded, if you will,
right.
And fully implemented across all levels.
Right.
We're evolving.
Yes.
And I'm hoping that this is a dramatic step in that evolution. We're going to see with Care Court. We're going to see whether we have the capacity. I think we do to break through some of those barriers. We have the capacity to think in a different way. We have the capacity to ensure that somebody is accountable for all aspects of getting people well and off the street.
Well, to the evolution of Care Court circa last year and to this year, you too were the ambassadors for this legislation this last year. It came about pretty quick, but this was indeed the governor's baby, right? I mean, the governor has seen the increases in homelessness and mental illness statistics, as you both have. He's the one that came to you and said, I need your help to get this done. Is that how it worked?
Oh, in my case, I actually volunteered.
Okay.
Because, my area of expertise, I chair the Judiciary Committee. I've spent a life in and out of courts and I was a prosecutor and that kind of thing. So I thought that I could lend some experience and expertise to this initiative. And I had some, family experience with schizophrenia. And so when I saw the governor was proposing this, I thought that I might be able to add value. And you're right, this is the governor's initiative, but I think Senator Eggman and I, while it's his baby, I think we've helped to raise that baby.
You are the perfect surrogate parents.
We added to that baby's education and nurturing, and we'll continue to do so.
We rock that baby.
Yeah. Now you've sent it out to the world and hoping it will become an independent, fully sentient success story.
And the same with Senator Umberg, and it was great partnering with him. And I think it was a good move by the administration to work with both of us, coming at it from two different hats. And I had been in a lot of conversation. I've tried to work in this mental health space, especially in the Senate, but in a lot of conversations with Dr. Galley and others about our need to do something. But there's some things that a legislator can't do by themselves, and that you need a big administrative hand. And Dr. Galley and the governor have really been phenomenal on this.
But for the governor's interest and initiative, we would be able to do this. This requires huge amount of coordination, huge amount of resources, advocacy, and the governor has been completely, I wouldn't say on board, he's been leading the charge on it.
That's encouraging, definitely.
This something like Care Court, which is transformative and hopefully will lead the nation, it needs to come from a strong governor's position.
Yeah.
Right.
I know that we have, challenges in other branches of government. We have a challenge in the legislative branch in terms of resourcing it, oversight. We want to keep tabs on this, and also the judiciary. One of the things that the outgoing Chief Justice did was to emphasize the importance of the judiciary engaging on this in a very meaningful way. One of my concerns is that, judges don't typically aspire to be a judge because they want to deal with some very, very difficult situations, some very difficult people who are in crisis. And so it requires a different skill set than maybe they thought they might need to be effective. And so the training of judges and staff to be able to fully implement this requires a lot of patience.
Well, you've already talked about some of the nuts and bolts, but to do my due diligence to get to some more details on Care Court, obviously funding in the last budget, you and the governor earmarked $88 million for Care Court, and in this new budget, he has projected $52 million to help the cities and counties with plans to increase the funding from there. So funding the support that the local governments get as they do this is not only a key resource, but it's also a key incentive to them.
That's correct. And funding, like everything, continues. We had our first budget hearing this morning that I was at previously. So yeah, those conversations will continue to be ongoing about the funding of this as we're facing a bigger deficit this year. But I think something Senator Umberg referenced was some of our MHSA money and really looking at, I think, what we already have available and how do we use that funding most effectively. And if I could add just one thing, when we're talking about Care Court and LPS and the kind of the extreme of one spectrum. But if we look at the whole continuum of care, we really need to talk about that and the amount that the administration really focused on early childhood mental health issues, standing up a platform for every child to be able to have a mental health assessment, really getting early care in schools. All of those things, hopefully, look at the long term of keeping people out from being at their very sickest.
Mm-hmm. One of the key elements of this has been independence and the agency, if you will, of the person involved. Is this a voluntary kind of program? Is this something that, obviously there's going to be issues where the person cannot make decisions on their behalf, but nobody's being coerced into Care Court participation?
That is true. Nobody will be coerced. Nobody, you'll be encouraged. There'll be a care plan. You'll work together. But if people choose not to, then they find themselves back in the same situation where they were before, potentially committing a crime and or being conserved.
Then conservatorship is the next?
Not by direction of the Care Court,
Uh-huh.
but potentially by direction of their untreated mental health if they're back on the streets.
And the key element of this is just there's somebody, whether it's a judge or an advocate, who's walking this person, so to speak, through the process. It's not throwing them to a program, wishing them luck, and keeping our fingers crossed.
One of the misconceptions, I think, is that this somehow is part of the criminal justice process. It is not.
Right.
In fact, we want to keep people out of the criminal justice system. And so while it's administered by a court, if for whatever reason it doesn't work, the step is conservatorship, not incarceration. Senator Eggman's correct. I mean, if you simply won't participate and you commit a crime, then you may go back in the criminal justice system. But people who are schizophrenic, it doesn't mean that they're absent their faculties at all times. They can agree to a treatment plan when they're lucid. They can agree to, this is what I would like to have happen if I'm having a psychotic episode, that kind of thing. But there is, and for whatever reason, there's a misconception that somehow this is coercive. Senator Eggman's correct. We're going to create the environment for you to get better. We're going to do whatever we can so you're stabilized, so that medication is available, so your assistance of your behavioral health professionals are available, so that you can make the right choices.
In your explanations and details of Care Court, I know you're very familiar with a lot of the different interest groups, advocates who have deep concerns and opposition to Care Court, that it's based on stigma and stereotypes of people living with mental illness will disproportionately impact persons of color, merely creates a framework for the same failed approach to making mental illness tantamount to a crime, and despite efforts to separate law enforcement from mental health calls and related actions, and that's another whole separate issue, Care Court still pushes in the opposite direction, requiring law enforcement to still be frontline responders. Now, again, you've already touched on some of this in your explanations, but what are your responses collectively to this barrage of opposition that you've had over the last year?
Let me speak to some of the law enforcement elements. Is that, by the way, the law enforcement community, they don't want to be first responders to somebody having a psychotic episode, but they are. I mean, they are, because someone calls the police and says someone is doing something, either a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or maybe committing a crime that is a consequence of somebody in psychosis. And so they're going to be there first. Adding other mental health professionals to the first responding team, great idea. Law enforcement completely supports that. But we can't completely take law enforcement out of the equation, because they, by definition, are going to get the phone call to deal with the person who's doing whatever he or she is doing at the time. But the response is not to put them in jail, but to get them in a system, a stabilized system, where we can provide some short-term stabilization, then longer-term stabilization with housing. The folks who have concern about the fact that court can be a scary place. It can be a scary place for all of us, and particularly scary if you have schizophrenia and you've been in court before and you've gone from court to jail to prison. And I understand that. And I think the governor's office understands that as well. And so one of our challenges is to make it as supportive as we possibly can with someone who is a supporter, not a necessarily public defender, although they will have counsel when they're engaged, not have a prosecutor there who's trying to put them in jail, but have a team that's trying to get them well.
You know, this current situation is not acceptable for anybody. It's not acceptable as it is, and it's being responded to by law enforcement without tools. What Care Court is providing is tools to actually help people get better and move down in the level of treatment. Not to have less rights, but to be able to have more rights.
To have somebody living under a bridge, to have the freedom of choice to live under a bridge while you're mentally ill
is not freedom.
It is not freedom. That's exactly right. And folks who say all we need to do is just put more money into the system and let them continue to make choices, while they're not possessed of their faculties, that doesn't work. Especially doesn't work for their families who care about them deeply and want them to get better and know that living under a bridge is not an environment where anybody can ever get better.
I just want to go back to the point about it's going to impact poor people and people of color. It is, again, another shame on our system that people who suffer from the highest degrees of mental health issues are oftentimes people of color and poor people, because we know poverty is a major factor in people experiencing trauma, experiencing lack of education, all the things that kind of this historical racism that we've had in our country, I don't think anyone denies that, has had generational impacts of people. And so what we're saying is that people should be first in line who have been historically overlooked and marginalized. We should be doing everything we can to make sure that they get the care that they deserve and need.
And I want to make sure that we dispel the mutual exclusivity idea of homelessness and mental illness. Just because you're mentally ill or suffering from mental illness doesn't mean you're homeless, and vice versa. You want to clarify or emphasize
that's absolutely
that?
right. You can be referred to care court by a family member, by a teacher, an employer, law enforcement, by a number of different individuals and entities. And while one of the places that schizophrenia and those with schizophrenia, where it's most intractable is with the homeless population. But that doesn't mean that those who are housed don't have those issues and don't need the support of care court and can be referred. We have in our own family, we have a situation where someone is housed right now, but is in need of treatment and not receiving it. So.
And also not to say that everybody who is unhoused has mental health issues.
Right.
But what we see is most visible, I think, that for people to see is that nexus of that overlap between people who are significant in mental health issues and those who are homeless.
And Senator, you did mention you went to Mark Rippey's funeral. You had actually met him, talked to his family. Mark's story and his memorial this last week have been the subject of some really candid columns in the Sacramento Bee recently, taking political leaders and lawmakers really to task for letting him die, essentially, is what one of the columnists said, refusing requests for help from his family at every turn, and that those political leaders and lawmakers should have been there. But, Senator, you actually were there, which really was an extraordinary gesture. And I guess to both of you, and I know you've heard this trope before, but let's just bring it up in the context of this. It's been said often that when there is a crisis, the legislature only applies Band-Aids to problems as opposed to coming up with a bigger picture solution because it's too difficult or there isn't enough time or will. Is that assessment fair? And actually, is care court really the next step? And if people want big picture solutions, this is one of them. What do you say to that?
A couple of things. One, there's some truth to that we do respond to crises. This is a crisis. I don't think it's a Band-Aid. I think that this is something much more significant in terms of structural change, number one. Number two is that this is not a panacea. This is not going to solve homelessness. This is not going to solve the issue of those with severe mental illness. What it's going to do is I think it's going to make a significant difference. But irrespective of the success of care court, we're still going to have to address this issue. This is an issue that's going to be with us forever.
When you went to the memorial, Senator, I know you touched on these issues. You acknowledged how much help was needed or should have been given and was not.
No, absolutely. But I do not think care court is a Band-Aid. And I think the crisis has pushed people not to just provide platitudes, but to know that they really have to follow that up with policy and dollars and workforce. We can't not say that we don't also have a workforce crisis, that we'll need to get more mental health providers out there, educated and in the field, ready to work.
Looking forward, if we'll follow the care court as your baby metaphor here, yeah. What's the future here in terms of what you will do in the legislature? Obviously, you're going to monitor its success, particularly as the pilot programs come in to the end of this year and early next. Any other work related to this field? Further modifying LPS so it better addresses a 21st century reality. I know you have a bill that will amend the current official definition of the phrase gravely disabled. Anything else in this arena that you guys are working on here for 2023 that will continue to help fill in the blanks, raise awareness, and bring protection?
I'll be working in this area again, and we're looking at, as I mentioned before, how do we use our money most effectively? Some changes to the MHSA, or the Mental Health Services Act, Prop 63. We're going to be working on that, and also working on the definition of gravely disabled. So I hope Senator Umberg's ready to do a little bit more work. I think that is one of the cornerstones we need to do after care court, because if care court doesn't work, there needs to be no holes left in our safety net. And the LPS conservatorship is that next step. And right now you can drive a truck through it, and every county interprets it differently, what it means to be gravely disabled. So I think it's time for our definitions to match up with our realities.
So we're gathering information from the 7 counties that are in the first cohort, now I think 8 with Los Angeles County, as to what we need to do legislatively to make it a successful initiative. And so I have a bill, it's commonly called a spot bill here, which means it's a bill that we'll use to help implement care court as we become aware of the needs in terms of housing. What's the authority of the court to order housing? In terms of behavioral health professionals, we clearly have a lack of behavioral health professionals here in California. We had an issue with the lack of behavioral health professionals before care court. Now we are going to require even more. So what do we do to make sure that we generate the workforce that can support it? So we got some issues that we're working on, and we're mindful of that.
Final question. We, of course, all really truly feel for and empathize with those families who are dealing with mental illness amongst their loved ones. You both have, either right now or in the past, have talked to me about your own family experiences. And there, but for the grace of God, go the rest of us and our families in what is really a difficult journey. And, of course, the practitioners and the caretakers who are trying to help those folks with limited authority and sometimes not nearly as much money as they would want. And yet the rest of us are still stepping over the bodies, driving past our fellow human beings who are half naked on the street or shouting at invisible phantoms, or we spray them with a water hose, as we have read about recently, which was truly a despicable story. And then we return to our own problems, because, we all got problems. There was a recent story in the New York Times talking about the incredible selfless community efforts on the streets of New York City, every night triaging medical help for the homeless, securing assistance and security and commitment for the mentally ill. This amazing effort by physicians and clinicians and social workers. And when one of the doctors was asked to reflect on it, he said this profound thing. He said, "This is what we do while we're waiting for the world to change." So as a parting thought, what has to be done? More political engagement, economic engagement, business community engagement, healthcare, holistic, empathetic level for the world to change?
All of the above. I think our eyes are opened, and we need to keep just pushing this massive boulder up the hill. I think, I think in some respects, the polarization and loss that we've all encountered during COVID, I think part of it is becoming immune to what we see on the streets is one more component of that, where we don't see each other as humans and we see each other as the enemy or the problem. And so I think continuing to work on this, I think we can heal a lot of our divides when we see each other as human beings and really do our best to try to care for one another.
Yeah. Senator? It's hard. It's hard to step outside yourself. It's hard for me to step outside myself when I see someone who's homeless, who, as you just described, maybe, screaming obscenities. Very difficult. But what inspires me are those who make it their life's work to, treat their physical ailments, to treat their mental distress, to do what they can to provide shelter. Those folks, they're really following the gospel of making sure that what you do to the least of my brethren, you do unto me. And so they inspire me.
Thank you both, Senators, for being part of this, for taking time together on a busy day to talk about this issue, which I know is not just legislative business, but is part of the human element and is personal to both of you. Good luck with Care Court and seeing your baby come to life here in the courts and here in California. And thank you both for joining us here on Then There's California.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Dr. Susan Eggman of Stockton, State Senator, Chair of the Senate Health Committee, and Senator Tom Umberg of Orange County, the Chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. That brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, proud to have technical and production assistance from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, Michelle Baker, Ann DeGrazia, Lisa Murphy, McClina Woods, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.